Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going full-on construction site. You know, hard hats and high-vis jackets, the whole shebang. But we're not here to pour concrete. We're diving deep into the laws that make these sites safe, especially for the folks living right next door.
It's an area where those legal lines really meet the physical world. Pretty interesting stuff.
Absolutely. And we've got the blueprints, so to speak, from legal texts, government guidelines, even some real-life stories about construction gone wrong or right, depending how you look at it.
Yeah.
We want you to walk away understanding how these projects stay safe and how they try to keep the peace with the neighbors, ready to break ground.
Let's lay the foundation, shall we?
Perfect. Now, I think a lot of people see a construction site and think it just appears overnight, but there's this whole legal process to make sure it's done right, not just throwing up some walls.
Oh, absolutely. It starts with getting the planning permission and building control. These are key for a safe project, but also a sustainable one, and one that's not going to make the whole neighborhood unhappy.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. Planning permission, that's just a formality, right? A piece of paper and you're good to go.
Not quite. It's actually a pretty big deal. Before even a shovel goes in the ground, developers need the thumbs up from the local planning authority. And those folks, they don't just sign anything. They've got a whole list of things they look at.
Give us the insider scoop. What are they looking for?
Well, first off, does the project make sense for the area? Does it fit with the community's needs and the local development plans? Then there's the environmental impact. How will traffic flow be affected? Even how it'll look aesthetically in the neighborhood. They want new buildings to make things better, not worse, you know?
So it's really about the big picture, considering everybody, not just the developer with their plans.
Exactly right. And it's not like these decisions are made in a bubble. They look at national guidelines, too, like the National Planning Policy Framework. That's like their rule book for sustainable development here in England.
Finding that sweet spot between letting the economy grow, but also protecting the environment and how people live in the area.
That's the idea. Now, once they've got that planning permission hurdle cleared, then the focus shifts to building regulations.
And this is where we get into the actual nuts and bolts of the building, right? Making sure it's safe and sound structurally.
You got it. Building regulations, they set the minimum standards for everything, how it's designed, how it's built, and safety is huge, so is health and accessibility. And here's where it gets interesting. Did you know that there are different building regulations based on the type of building?
Oh, really? Tell me more about that.
Well, think about it. A small apartment building, 3 stories, that's going to have different safety concerns than a giant skyscraper, right? So the regulations reflect that. Like fire safety, much stricter in a high-rise because getting everyone out safely is a lot more complicated.
That makes total sense, right?
Yeah.
Adapting the rules to the challenges of each specific building.
And to help everyone out, there are these guides, approved documents they're called. They break down exactly how to meet those building regulations. Super helpful when it's all so complex.
Okay, so we've got planning permission, making sure the project fits in, building regulations, making sure the structure is safe. But what about the people who live or work right next to these sites? All that noise, the dust, how are they protected from the disruption?
Now that's where things get even more interesting, because on top of all that, there's a whole other set of laws specifically about how those construction sites impact the people around them.
Okay, I'm all ears. Let's talk about how the law protects those folks. I think they're called adjoining land users sometimes.
That's the term. And the first thing is this idea called occupier's liability. Basically, anyone who owns or uses a piece of land, they're legally responsible to make sure it's safe for anyone who sets foot on it.
So on a construction site, that means making it secure, like fencing it off, having signs up so people don't wander in and get hurt.
Exactly. It's like you wouldn't just leave a giant hole in the ground unguarded, right? It's about protecting everyone, the workers, the public, everyone.
Makes sense. But what if something goes wrong, even with those precautions? Like a worker drops something and it damages neighbor's property.
Then another legal concept kicks in. This one's called vicarious liability. This is all about the employer being responsible for what their workers do.
So if a worker makes a mistake, causes damage, the employer could be held responsible even if they didn't tell the worker to do the wrong thing.
That's the idea. It's about making sure companies take responsibility for what happens on their projects and really that they're promoting a culture of safety on those sites.
Like a safety net, making sure someone is accountable when things go wrong, even honest mistakes.
Exactly. Now, even with all these rules and laws, disagreements happen during construction. It's just the nature of the beast.
Oh, I can imagine. Delays, costs going up, neighbors getting frustrated. What happens when those turn into real disputes? Is it a free-for-all?
Not at all. There are actually specific ways to resolve those. We have special courts like the Technology and Construction Court. They're the experts in sorting out those complex construction cases.
So they know all the ins and outs of construction law, the ones to untangle those legal knots.
That's them. But there's also this growing trend of using what's called alternative dispute resolution, or ADR.
ADR, what's that all about?
Well, ADR methods, things like mediation or arbitration, they're seen as a more cooperative way to handle disputes. Instead of fighting it out in court, you work with a neutral person to try to find a solution everyone can live with.
So it's not about winning or losing, but about finding a compromise, something that works for everybody.
That's the goal. ADR can be faster, cheaper, and less adversarial, which everyone appreciates.
All right, so we've covered a lot. Planning permission to make sure the project fits in, building regs for a safe structure, then occupier's liability and vicarious liability to protect folks nearby if there's an accident, and then the courts or ADR if things go south. Quite the system.
It is, and it shows how seriously the law takes construction safety and how these projects impact those living around them. But we've only just scratched the surface.
I'm ready for more. Let's dig deeper.
Welcome back. We've set the scene, talked about how planning permission and building regulations make sure construction projects are safe and fit in with the community. And, of course, how those near the site are protected, especially if accidents happen.
Right, we got into occupier's liability, keeping those construction sites secure, and vicarious liability, making sure employers are responsible for their workers' actions.
Now let's get into some specific cases, real-world examples of how these legal ideas play out when construction meets the neighbors, shall we?
Love it. Seeing how it all works in real life is always fascinating.
Well, remember those building regulations we talked about? Different standards for different types of buildings.
Yeah, like how fire safety is way more strict for high-rises because getting everyone out is so much harder.
Exactly. And there's this tragic event that really brought this to light, the Grenfell Tower fire in London back in 2017. A terrible reminder of what can happen when building regulations aren't followed or enforced properly.
That was heartbreaking, and it really led to a lot of changes in the industry, didn't it?
It did.
Yeah.
Major reviews, changes to building regulations, especially for those tall residential buildings, they really scrutinized the use of flammable materials. New rules came in to prevent another tragedy like that.
So a real turning point, forcing everyone to look closely at how we keep people safe in high-rises.
Absolutely. Building regulations, they're not just red tape. They're there to save lives, to prevent those worst-case scenarios.
Makes you think. Okay, so building regulations are vital, especially when it comes to fire safety in high-rises. But let's come back down to earth, literally. Let's talk more about trespass.
Trespass, good old unauthorized entry onto someone's land. Sounds simple, but on construction sites, things can get messy.
Yeah, and it's not just a worker accidentally stepping over a line. It could be all sorts of intrusions, can't it?
Exactly. Think about construction materials being stored on a neighbor's land, vehicles driving over their lawn, even a crane swinging over their house. That's all potential trespass, even if it wasn't intentional.
The crane thing, that's wild. So even the airspace above my property is protected.
It is. And those trespasses, they can have legal consequences for the company.
So what happens if they are found to have trespassed? What are the typical remedies?
It depends, really, on what happened, how bad it was. Sometimes it's just about fixing the problem, move the materials, adjust that crane so it stays within bounds.
Making things right, essentially.
Right. But sometimes, if there's damage or major disruption, the landowner might seek compensation, money. Imagine those vehicles driving over someone's prized garden. That'll cost you.
Ouch. Yeah, I'd be pretty upset about that. So there's a financial incentive to be careful with those property lines.
Absolutely. And in some cases, if it's really bad, the landowner might even go to court to get an injunction that's a legal order to stop the construction altogether. That's serious stuff. Shows how important these property rights are.
Wow, so there's real teeth to these laws. So we've got trespass, the physical intrusion onto someone's land. But what about those things that aren't so physical but still annoying? The noise, the dust, the shaking.
Yes, those fall under the wonderful legal concept of nuisance.
Right, nuisance, that's the word. It's about those unreasonable interferences with someone enjoying their property.
That's it. The constant roar of machinery, dust clouds settling everywhere, the house shaking from heavy equipment. Classic construction nuisances.
And I imagine the line between what's acceptable and what's a nuisance, that could be tricky to figure out.
It can. The law gets that construction is necessary, some noise is unavoidable. The question is, does it go too far? Does it become unreasonable?
So how do courts figure out what's unreasonable? Do they have a decibel meter for noise or something?
Huh. If only it were that simple. They look at a bunch of things. How loud, how long it goes on for, the time of day, what kind of neighborhood is it? Are the builders doing what they can to minimize the disruption?
So a bit of hammering during the day in a busy area, maybe not a big deal. But that same hammering at night in a quiet residential street, totally different story.
Exactly. And if they're using noise barriers, dust control, scheduling noisy work for less sensitive times, that shows they're trying to be good neighbors.
It's about being considerate, even when you're in the middle of this huge project.
Right. And, being proactive, talking to the neighbors, that can prevent a lot of these nuisance claims from becoming lawsuits.
So if you're a construction company, keep those lines of communication open, let people know what to expect.
Absolutely. Transparency and working together can really help keep the peace and prevent those neighborly disputes.
Okay, trespass and nuisance, those are the big ones, protecting folks next to construction sites. But let's zoom out a bit, talk about contract and land law. How do those play into all of this?
Now we're getting into the nitty-gritty of ownership, agreements, the land itself.
Because before you even think about building, you got to know who owns the land and what they can do with it, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the history of land ownership in the UK, it's actually quite fascinating, and it affects how we approach construction even today. Did you know our system is rooted all the way back to the Norman Conquest in 1066?
1066. Wow, that's going way back.
It is. After William the Conqueror won at Hastings, he basically said, all this land, it's mine now. Then he gave chunks of it to his buddies.
Talk about a power move.
Right. This whole system, feudalism, it created a hierarchy of land ownership that, believe it or not, still shapes our legal system today.
So even though we're not in medieval times, those old ideas still matter for modern construction.
They do, especially those concepts of freehold and leasehold ownership. Remember those?
Yeah, freehold, you own it outright. Leasehold, it's more like renting long-term.
Exactly. And those are huge in construction. It affects who can build, what limitations there are, what the land can be used for.
So if you're a developer, gotta know if it's freehold or leasehold before you even draw up plans.
Absolutely. And then, just to spice things up, we have these things called easements and freehold covenants. They add whole other layers of complexity.
Ah, yes, easements and covenants. Always makes my head spin a bit.
I know, they sound intimidating, but they're not so bad once you understand them. An easement is basically a right someone has over someone else's land, even though they don't own it.
Okay, so like if someone has a right-of-way to cross my property to get to their own.
Perfect example. And in construction, easements are crucial. Accessing the site, laying utility lines, even just letting vehicles through.
If those easements aren't clear from the start, that could get messy. What about freehold covenants? Those sound even more confusing.
Freehold covenants are like promises or restrictions attached to the land. And they stick around even when the land is sold. It's like the previous owners have a say in what happens.
So even if I own the land, there might be limits on what I can do because of these covenants.
Exactly. Say there's a covenant saying you can't build above a certain height. Even though you own the land, you've got to respect that.
It's like this hidden web of legal rules connecting properties and dictating what can be built. You really need those legal experts to navigate all this.
No doubt about it. And speaking of legal things, let's not forget about contracts, the backbone of every construction project.
The contracts, right, those legally binding agreements, making sure everyone's on the same page, knows what they're supposed to do.
Exactly. Contracts in construction, they lay out everyone's rights and obligations. The client, the contractor, the subcontractors, everything's in there. Payment schedules, timelines, quality standards, even what happens if things go wrong.
And I bet there are a lot of opportunities for things to go wrong on a construction project.
Oh, you bet. Construction contracts are notoriously complex, and disagreements are almost inevitable. But there's one piece of legislation that's especially relevant to our discussion about neighbors. That's the Party Wall, Etc. Act of 1996.
The Party Wall Act rings a bell. We talked about that a bit earlier, right?
We did. And it's worth revisiting because it specifically deals with construction work that affects those shared walls between properties, the party walls.
Okay, so say I want to build an extension, and it's going to involve the wall I share with my neighbor.
Bingo. That's where the Party Wall Act kicks in. It's got rules about notifying your neighbor, getting their consent, and what to do if you disagree.
So it's trying to prevent those neighbor wars that happen when construction gets too close for comfort.
Exactly. The Party Wall Act is there to protect both sides. The one doing the building and the one next door who might be affected.
A legal referee making sure everyone plays fair.
That's a great way to put it. But even with these rules, things can still get tricky.
I can imagine. People get emotional about their homes, and construction can be stressful.
For sure. And sometimes those disagreements turn into big legal fights, which just costs everyone time and money.
Sounds like communication and compromise are key when it comes to party walls.
Couldn't agree more. Having those open conversations with your neighbors before you start swinging hammers can save everyone a lot of headaches down the road.
Well, I think we've did a pretty good job of mapping out the legal side of how construction sites and their neighbors interact.
I think so too. We've covered those basic principles of ownership, agreements, and the specific laws to minimize disruption and protect those living nearby.
From ancient land ownership quirks to modern-day issues with noise, dust, and those potty walls, it's amazing how much law is tied up in construction. But there's one more big piece we haven't discussed yet: insurance.
Insurance, the financial safety net that protects everyone in construction from those inevitable risks, things you just can't predict.
Because things go wrong on construction sites, even when everyone's trying their best.
Oh, absolutely. Insurance helps soften the blow. It gives financial protection and peace of mind for everyone involved. The developers, the contractors, the workers, even the neighbors.
We've talked about public liability insurance and employer's liability, those basic ones to protect against claims from the public or employees.
Right. But there are a whole bunch of other types of insurance that are often required or recommended for construction projects. And one that's especially important, given the risks we've been talking about, is contractors' all risks insurance.
Okay, contractors all risks insurance. Break that down for us.
Think of it like a big shield for the construction company, protecting them from a ton of potential problems that can pop up during the project.
Like what? What kind of things are we talking about?
Well, it can cover damage to the building while it's under construction, damage to the materials stored on site, theft of equipment, and even liability for damage they might cause to third parties, including those neighbors we've been talking about.
So if a storm damages the structure before it's finished, or if a piece of equipment malfunctions and causes damage to a neighbor's property, that's when contractors all risks steps in.
Exactly. It's essential to protect the construction company from potentially huge financial losses.
Sounds like it should be mandatory for any project, especially one near other properties.
You're not wrong. And then there are other more specialized types of insurance that might be needed depending on the project.
Such as,
Well, there's professional indemnity insurance that covers professionals like architects and engineers if someone claims they were negligent. So if an architect makes a design mistake that leads to problems later on, their insurance would help cover the costs.
makes sense, like a backup plan for those oops moments,
Yeah.
even for the best professionals.
Exactly. And then we have latent defects insurance. This one's becoming increasingly important as buildings get more complex and high tech.
Latent defects, that sounds interesting. What are we talking about here?
Latent defects are those hidden flaws that might not be obvious during construction, but could show up years later and lead to expensive repairs.
So something like a hidden structural weakness that could cause problems down the line.
Exactly. Latent defects insurance provides long-term protection, particularly for new build projects. It ensures that someone's financially responsible for fixing those hidden problems even years after the project's finished.
That must be a huge relief, both for the construction company and the people who end up living there.
It is. It's all about managing those long-term risks and making sure construction projects don't leave a trail of problems behind.
Okay, so we have contractors all risks insurance for those immediate on-site risks, professional indemnity insurance for professionals giving advice, and latent defects insurance for those sneaky hidden flaws that might emerge later. It's a lot.
It is a lot to keep track of, that's for sure. But it goes to show how seriously the construction industry takes those potential risks and how insurance is a vital part of managing those risks and protecting everyone involved.
Well, I think we've done a fantastic job of unpacking these legal frameworks that govern how construction sites operate, and especially how they interact with the folks living and working nearby.
I agree. We've covered it all, those initial planning stages, the intricacies of trespass and nuisance, the world of contracts, and of course, the importance of insurance.
From historical land ownership to those very modern challenges of noise, dust, and party walls, it's amazing how much law is intertwined with construction. But our deep dive isn't over just yet.
You got it. We've still got more ground to cover.
Join us next time as we wrap up this fascinating look at construction site safety with some real-life case studies and a peek into the future of this constantly evolving industry. All right, welcome back for the final stretch of our construction site safety deep dive. We've talked a lot about the laws, but now I'm really keen to see how it all plays out in real life.
Well, get ready for some fascinating cases and even a glimpse into the future, construction tech style.
Let's start with a case that really shows why those building regulations matter, even when it's something that seems small.
You're right, overlooking what seems like a small detail, that can have big consequences down the line.
Okay, hit us with an example, a cautionary tale.
This one comes from Ireland. A couple building their dream home, things going great, until they decided to get a bit creative.
Creative, you mean like they went off script?
Exactly. Deviated from the approved plans, added some extra square footage, changed the roof design, thought they could slip it past the authorities.
Oh, I have a feeling this isn't going to end well.
It didn't. The local planning authority found out, and things blew up. Ended up going all the way to the Supreme Court.
Wow, the Supreme Court, that's serious business.
It was, and the court sided with the planning authority. The couple had to demolish those unauthorized parts of their house.
Oh, that's just awful.
Yeah.
Imagine all that time, money, effort, just to have to tear it down.
It's a harsh lesson that building regulations are there for a reason. They're not just suggestions. Gotta follow those approved plans, and if you want to change something, get permission first.
Absolutely. That dream home can turn into a nightmare if you try to cut corners.
No doubt. Okay, let's move on to something we talked about before, those party walls, the shared walls between properties.
Right. Those can be a real flashpoint for disputes. We talked about that party wall, etc. Act of 1996, the one that's supposed to keep things civil.
Exactly. Remember, that act has all these procedures for when construction involves those shared walls. It's about protecting both the owner doing the work and the owner next door who might be affected.
Trying to keep everyone happy, it's a balancing act. But anything involving neighbors, that's got potential for drama.
Oh, absolutely. Even with the rules, disputes happen.
Yeah.
Imagine you're planning an extension. It involves that party wall. You do everything right, send the party wall notice, outline the plans, even offer to hire a surveyor to oversee things.
Playing by the book, ticking all the boxes.
Right. But then the neighbor, maybe they're worried about damage, maybe they just don't like the extension, they decide not to cooperate.
Uh-oh, I can see where this is going.
It can get messy. They might refuse to give consent, disagree with your surveyor, or just ignore you completely.
So what happens then? Does the project just stop dead?
Thankfully, no. The Party Wall Act has ways to deal with disputes, but it takes time, can cost money. You might need your own surveyor, the neighbor might get theirs, and they have to try to work something out.
So even if you're doing everything right, it can still add delays and expenses.
It can. And sometimes those disputes even end up in court, which makes it even longer and more expensive.
It just shows that human element, personalities clashing, different points of view, that can complicate even the clearest legal process.
It's true. So much comes down to communication, being willing to find solutions that work for everyone.
Maybe a friendly chat over the fence before the plans are even finalized could prevent a lot of hassle.
A bit of neighborly diplomacy never hurts. Speaking of new approaches, let's talk about something that's changing construction in a big way. Technology.
Ah, yes, technology, it's moving fast, and that means new challenges for construction site safety, right?
Definitely. We're seeing more and more tech on sites, and that means new legal questions, too.
What kind of tech are we talking about here? Give us some examples.
Well, one that's becoming really common is using drones. Great for site surveys, inspections, monitoring progress.
I love those aerial shots you get from drones. It gives you such a sense of the scale of these projects.
They're amazing. But using them comes with challenges, too. Privacy concerns, data security, and what if a drone malfunctions and causes damage? Who's liable?
So new tools, but a whole new set of legal hoops to jump through.
Exactly. And then there's artificial intelligence, AI, that's really starting to make waves in the construction world, especially for safety.
AI on construction sites. Sounds like science fiction.
It might, but it's closer than you think. Imagine AI systems monitoring workers, spotting hazards in real time, even predicting accidents before they happen.
That's incredible. Could really transform safety on sites.
It could. But it also raises some big legal and ethical questions, like if an AI system fails to prevent an accident, who's at fault? The construction company, the people who made the software?
It's uncharted territory, legally and ethically, and we're probably just seeing the beginning of AI in construction.
Absolutely. Lots of potential benefits, but we need to be careful, make sure the laws keep pace, and that these technologies are used responsibly.
No doubt. Now, before we wrap up, let's come back to that idea of being a good neighbor. It's been a theme throughout our deep dive.
It's a big one because at the end of the day, construction projects affect the whole community around them.
And finding that balance, progress, but also protecting the people living and working nearby. That's key.
Couldn't agree more. And one thing that really promotes this idea of being a good neighbor is the considerate constructor scheme.
Right, the scheme that encourages companies to go above and beyond just the minimum legal requirements.
It's voluntary, but it's gaining popularity. Companies are realizing that being seen as responsible and considerate is a good thing.
So what kind of things does this scheme promote?
It covers a lot, really. Minimizing noise and dust, keeping the site tidy, respecting the community, communicating with the neighbors.
It's about thinking about those everyday impacts that can really make a difference for people's quality of life.
Exactly. Construction isn't just about buildings, it's about people and the places where they live.
And I imagine being considerate isn't just the right thing to do, it's good business sense, too.
It is. Companies with a reputation for being responsible, they often find it easier to get planning permission, build good relationships with local authorities, even attract and keep good employees.
Everybody wins. So as we wrap up this deep dive into construction site safety, it's clear that it goes beyond just following the rules. It's about creating a culture of responsibility, respect, and building a better future for everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We've covered so much, from planning and building regulations to trespass, nuisance, contracts, and insurance. We've looked at real cases, talked about the changing role of technology, and most importantly, emphasized that communication, collaboration, and being a good neighbor are absolutely essential.
It's been quite a journey. Thanks for joining us as we explore this fascinating world of construction law, and especially the importance of making sure those sites are safe and considerate of the communities around them. We hope we've learned something new and maybe even gained a new appreciation for the legal side of those construction projects we see popping up everywhere.
That's what we hope for. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep learning.
We'll see you on our next deep dive adventure.